This is Intelligence Matters, sponsored by Ginkgo Biosecurity, whose cutting-edge biological intelligence platform empowers national security decision-makers to identify and respond to emerging biological threats.
Stephanie Baker is an award-winning senior writer and investigative reporter at Bloomberg News. She began her career in Moscow in the 1990s and has followed Russia ever since. She joins us today to talk about her new book, Punishing Putin: Inside the Global Economic War to Bring Down Russia. We'll be right back with that discussion after a break. I'm Michael Morrell, and this is Intelligence Matters.
Biosecurity matters. What's biosecurity? It's the mission-critical industry safeguarding against 21st century biological threats. Biology doesn't respect borders. Ginkgo Biosecurity monitors critical assets and produces actionable biointelligence for national security decision-makers confronting biological threats, whether they are natural, accidental, or malicious. Ginkgo's technology tracks deadly pathogens worldwide, and our globally scaled platform, the first of its kind, detects outbreaks in near real time, deploys AI-powered threat assessments, and identifies the source of a threat, mitigating outbreaks before they become national emergencies. When lives and livelihoods are on the line, every second counts. Ginkgo Biosecurity, the biosecurity partner for an uncertain new era. Learn more at biosecuritymatters.com.
Stephanie, welcome to Intelligence Matters. It's great to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Congratulations on your new book, Punishing Putin: Inside the Global Economic War to Bring Down Russia. It's about the economic war that's accompanied the military war in Ukraine. It is a great read. It's terrific, really well done. It kind of strikes me as a geopolitical, geostrategic detective story a little bit. Does that resonate with you at all?
Yeah, I tried to tell it in a really compelling way to bring in a wider readership because, on the face of it, sanctions are kind of a wonky subject. I tried my best to use stories to tell how these sanctions unfolded and use the characters that were involved, either the people on the policymaking end in Washington, London, and Brussels, to the people who were setting up these evasion networks or the oligarchs who were being targeted by some of the sanctions. Yeah.
So only my listeners would think that sanctions are cool and something to dive into. But one of the things that I found in the book was it's actually a page turner, right? Who would think that a book on sanctions would be a page turner?
That is what I set out to do, because in reality, one of the reasons why I wanted to write the book is just all these dramatic stories unfolding. Let's face it, when hundreds of billions of dollars get frozen and locked down, and there are these huge battles to try to limit Russia's revenues, there is quite dramatic storytelling to be had. A lot of the Justice Department cases, they released pretty detailed indictments that I then took and tried to report out to fill in the holes. I wanted to tell the interesting stories behind some of these sanctions to help people understand what this all means.
Yeah. So the economic war, just like the real war, has its own stories, its own evolution, its own moves and counter moves. Where does the story start?
Well, I actually go back to the 90s and tell the story about what happened to Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union, during the chaotic Yeltsin presidency, because I realized you couldn't really tell the story of the sanctions, particularly against some of Russia's richest men, unless you kind of told the story of how we got there and explained the rise of Putin and why Putin came to power. In terms of the sanctions debate, I do go back to 2014 because I did think that was important to look at. How did the US and Europe respond to Putin's annexation of Crimea, the sort of first violation of the UN Charter? Let's putting aside Russia's incursion and invasion of Georgia in 2008, which was really the first. I've referenced that. But in terms of Ukraine, that was the first that was the first violation of the UN Charter. And I thought it was very interesting because there was an appetite in Europe for widespread sanctions. And I think the Obama administration was reluctant to go ahead without Europe on board. Yeah. And so they ended up on these very pinprick sanctions to try to make it harder for big Russian companies to raise money, to sort of clog up the financial plumbing, so to speak. Yeah. And it was interesting that they were applying the lessons of the financial crisis in reverse in some respects, looking at whether or not they could deploy tools to actually cause a financial crisis of some degree, which there was a degree of success on that. The sanctions coupled with declining oil prices did set off a currency crisis in Russia at the end of 2014, early 2015. But the bulk of the book really goes from 2022, because that's when there was this unprecedented wave of sanctions and this unique unity between the U.S., Europe, and the U.K., where they weren't aligned on everything, but they were more aligned than they'd ever been before. And it goes into everything from the initial assault on the financial structures supporting Russia, the efforts to kick Russian banks off of SWIFT, which is this Gmail messaging platform for banks internationally to send payments around the world, to the freezing of Russia's central bank reserves that were parked in Western financial institutions. And I go into that decision in quite a degree of detail, just because it ended up being this huge issue now, because now they froze this pot of money of roughly $300 billion belonging to Russia's central bank. Now they're debating trying to go to the next step and seize the money. And that's had all sorts of problems and disagreements.
Was there agreement in the West about freezing the central bank assets, or was that a kind of everybody thought about it and said that's a good thing to do, or were there real debates?
It happened within essentially 48 hours, and it had been considered before as the kind of extreme measure. But during that time period, and I recount this in the book, there was unity, but Secretary Yellen did have reservations about it and worried about the implications for the wider financial system. And she did, and I go into the story behind the scenes of how she spoke with Mario Draghi, the former European Central Bank president, and who was then the Prime Minister of Italy. And he said that he thought it would be a good idea. It would not pose risks to the wider financial system, and then they went ahead. So there was some degree of disagreement because it was an extreme measure to take.
Yeah,
if you remember before, there had been efforts, there had been freezing of other countries' central bank reserves, Afghanistan, Iran, Venezuela, but the amounts of money were very small. This was a huge pot of money. So it was really unprecedented, and they didn't really know how it would unfold, if there would be some sort of ramifications somewhere in the financial markets down the line.
And did Russia see this coming or not? This
was the thing that was in terms of war strategy, this was the thing he was not expecting. I think he didn't think that there would be enough unity in Europe to go ahead with such a measure. And I do explain in the book how Russia had gradually reduced its holdings in dollars after the annexation of Crimea and after a wave of sanctions in 2018, because he was worried about the U.S. doing something along these lines. And that, as a result of that, the bulk of Russia's central bank reserves in the West are actually in Europe. And he has proved right on that front, because Europe has been too divided to go the next step and seize the assets and use them for Ukraine.
Yeah. So in this economic war, who joined us in the fight, and just as important, who didn't?
Right. So the Sanctions Coalition is the EU, the US, Canada, UK, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and that combined coalition accounts for something like half of the world's GDP. So it's quite a formidable economic bloc. And so you would think in many ways that this would be an easier fight. But the fact of the matter is there were a lot of countries, some in the global south, and obviously the biggies, China and India, who did not join this coalition. And that has posed continuing problems to the enforcement and efficacy of sanctions for the past 2.5 years. And I think that's been a real challenge and you see this constant shuttle diplomacy to some of these countries, particularly the former Soviet states that have been the locus of parallel imports into Russia, sanctions evasion, et cetera. U.S. officials, EU officials trying to persuade these countries to follow U.S. sanctions and enforce them. And they've had some success, but they've had a lot of difficulties.
Yeah. Have they eroded a bit over time, or has there been, steps to make sure that any loopholes are closed and anything Russia does, you try to close that as soon as it shows up? So how do you kind of assess the effectiveness over time?
Right. So Russia has been able to adapt and figure out ways around these sanctions in many respects. And it depends on what you're talking about. If you're talking about consumer goods, cars, iPhones, that sort of thing, there's been an elaborate network of parallel imports, shipments to places like Kazakhstan or Georgia, and then those goods are then shipped on to Russia, often at a massive markup. So this isn't a complete loss for the Sanctions Coalition. It is imposing significant costs. It's contributing to persistently high inflation in Russia, which is having a big economic impact. But obviously the big one is China.
Yeah.
And I've done a lot of subsequent reporting on this, that China has been the country that has shipped semiconductors to Russia in huge volumes in violation of the U.S. export controls. And that has been a huge loophole that has been difficult to shut down. Now, in December, the Biden administration warned that it would impose secondary sanctions, so sanctions on foreign banks that do business with sanctioned entities in Russia. It warned it would impose sanctions on anyone that did business with Russia's military-industrial complex. Then it widened that definition in June. And that has actually had a real impact, and you see it playing out in Moscow today. And this has just happened over the summer after I finished writing my book. But there's been Chinese banks have been scared away from payments to Russia because they don't want to be hit with U.S. sanctions and being frozen out of the U.S. dollar. And in Russia, you see that there's a shortage of yuan. The cost of borrowing yuan is like multiple times higher than it is in China. So in that sense, it is having an effect, just the threat of secondary sanctions, because let's face it, those banks, Chinese banks, the amount of trade that they're doing with Russia is relatively small in the grand scheme of things. They don't want to be shut out of the global marketplace, which is primarily a US dollar global economy, for the sake of a relatively small business with Russia. So, I think the Biden administration could probably go further on that to really shut that down. It's hard to see how much it's affected trade because there's this lag and a lot of difficulties reading Russian customs data.
Yeah. So maybe just take a second and explain what secondary sanctions are, just to make sure everybody knows what we're talking about here.
Yeah, so there's sanctions on companies in third countries that are doing business with sanctioned entities. Yeah. So they would say, take a Chinese bank. They're doing business with a sanctioned Russian defense enterprise. The U.S. could come in and sanction that Chinese bank for doing business with that Russian defense enterprise.
Yeah. So this was an invention of the Bush administration in its sanctions effort against Iran.
Right.
Yeah,
exactly.
It really changed the whole sanctions game, right? It went from, some level of effectiveness to an extraordinarily high level of effectiveness.
Right, and there was this huge division, as I'm sure you know, with Europe over this. Europe complaining about these secondary sanctions and having to follow the U.S. sanctions on Iran.
Yeah. So Stephanie, a military war has collateral damage. and the economic war does too. And you talk about this. Can you share a little bit on that? I think this is pretty interesting.
Oh, there's so many levels on which there was collateral damage or unintended consequences. I think one of the unfortunate ones was that, there were some Russians that were fleeing, in particular Putin's mobilization orders in September 2022, who had difficulty getting money out. Their Visa and MasterCard withdrew from Russia. So a lot of these ordinary Russians, who I actually was quite sympathetic to, we should be doing everything we can to make it harder for Putin to recruit for the Russian military. We're having a hard time getting out to avoid any of those, potential mobilization orders. That's one. There were others, the Western companies, for instance, that left Russia. And I wrote about this at length in the book and kind of used McDonald's as the model that after an initial shock about the invasion, they had been they blazed a trail for other Western companies in Russia by being the first to open up in 1990 in Pushkin Square. After the invasion, I think they were initially reluctant to move, having been there for over 30 years. But then they quickly pivoted, and I do hold them up as the sort of model of how other Western companies should have acted. They got out, they found a buyer, they negotiated terms in a way that protected their brand, and others also got out. Some waited and hoped that they could get a better deal. Some thought maybe the war would blow over. But there were, a series of examples of companies that were taken over by Russian businessmen who were enriched in the process. Now, I think long term, that is not going to be good for Russia. I think it's going to, they've taken over a lot of Western brands and copied them. These copycat brands have taken over McDonald's, Starbucks, what have you. I think long term, it's not good for Russia, but that was one of the unintended consequences and a collateral damage from this war.
We're talking with Stephanie Baker from Bloomberg News, and we'll be right back with more after a quick break. Stay with us.
Beacon Global Strategies is the premier national security advisory firm. Beacon works side by side with leading companies to help them understand national security policy, geopolitical risk, global technology policy, and federal procurement trends. Beacon's insight gives business leaders the decision advantage. Founded in 2013, Beacon develops and supports the execution of bespoke strategies to mitigate business risk, drive growth, and navigate a complex geopolitical environment. With a bipartisan team and decades of experience, Beacon provides a global perspective to help clients tackle their toughest challenges.
Stephanie, one of the things that struck me watching sanctions and their impacts over the years, from the agency, was that, they had real economic effects, as we've talked about here on Russia. But because of the collateral damage, it often brought the people closer together to the regime. Right? We instead of pulling them apart, we brought them together. What's happened in Russia?
Right. You see that with some of the Russian billionaires who were sanctioned in the West and didn't have access to their cash piles in the West because their assets were frozen. And so they went back to almost all of them, bar one, more or less went back to Russia and ended up siding with Putin. Now, could the sanctions have been a bit more sophisticated in trying to decipher between who's who? Because a lot of these guys made their money in very questionable ways through fixed privatization auctions in the 90s and a lot of unsavory business deals. But some of them had tried to kind of position themselves as more Western facing. And I think many of them didn't want this war because it has been costly for them. But could they have done it in a way where they tried to split the elite more effectively? And now, in practical terms, I think that was really hard. And, there was probably certainly a lot of intelligence that I wasn't even, privy to in my reporting that maybe made them move against certain oligarchs faster than others. But I do think that they ended up there was some strange decisions about who they targeted and who they didn't, and who they were late to target. I think it was very hard for them to figure out who was who and who was really propping up the regime, who was really part of the defense industrial complex. Some figures were sanctioned very late in the game. Others that were far more Western facing were, sanctioned pretty early on. So that has not been a wholesale success. But I do argue in the book that sanctions on these Russian billionaires are legitimate in the fact that the sanctions regime is trying to go after the Russian economy as a whole, and they are major players in the Russian economy. Yeah. So if you want to try to weaken Putin's ability to sustain and finance the war, going after some of these billionaires who control huge swathes of the Russian economy is fair game.
Yeah. So was there any objective beyond simply weakening Putin's ability to conduct a war?
I think initially there were some high hopes that the unprecedented nature of the sanctions would cause the Russian economy to collapse and Putin to force Putin out. You did see a massive drop in the ruble in those first few weeks, particularly after the seizing of the central bank reserves. But Russia has a very smart central banker that has helped Putin stabilize the economy, Elvira Nabiullina, and she put in capital controls and hiked interest rates and kind of stabilized the whole thing. So I think that helped enormously.
Yeah, and China and India as well, right?
Right. Well, I mean, yeah, that's the other. One of the arguments I make in the book is that oil is the key here.
Yeah,
oil is the mainstay of the Russian economy, has been going back decades. It contributed to the weakening of the Soviet state in the late 80s. The 90s, oil prices globally, relatively speaking, were pretty low, and that helped. That contributed to all the financial difficulties that Russia faced, in the 90s as they tried to transition away from state planning. But Putin has enjoyed a relatively high price for oil, and that has enabled him to modernize the military and invest in the military. And until the U.S. and Europe can figure out a way to more effectively cap his oil revenues, it's going to be really hard to hit him where it hurts and undermine his ability to sustain the war. Because I think the goal of the sanctions shifted, as time went on. They realized this was not going to be easy to dislodge him. That was never the stated aim. Let's be clear. That was it was all about behavior change, trying to get him to pay higher costs for maintaining the war. They have been effective in doing that in terms of it. The sanctions have cost Russia hundreds of billions of dollars, and you do see the Russian economy coming under pressure because of sanctions, as well as the high spending that Putin has adopted to put the economy on a war footing.
Yeah. So China's interest here, right, is pretty clear. It's to do whatever you can to undermine the United States and the world, right, and stifle U.S. objectives, at every turn. To some degree, getting oil, more cheaply than they could otherwise. What about India? Is it all economics, or is it bigger than that?
Right. So India has played this very interesting role. To the surprise of many, let's go back and explain briefly. The G7 came together in December 2022 and agreed to cap the price of Russian oil. They would bar Western services like insurance for Russian oil unless it was sold at under $60 a barrel. That worked for a few months, and then Russia built a shadow fleet of oil tankers to transport oil to new markets outside of the EU embargo. And I think there was an understanding and a belief in Washington that there would be opportunistic buyers out there that would take advantage of discounted Russian oil, and they wanted that to happen because they wanted Russian oil to continue flowing. But I don't think anyone imagined that India would step up to the extent it has and buy Russian oil. It went from importing about 1% of its oil from Russia to 40% roughly. It goes up and down. But and you see India playing both sides. very strategically, taking advantage of what is still discounted Russian oil, and then trying to play nice with the U.S. at the same time. So it's been a difficult balancing act, I think, both for the G7 as well as India to keep this going. But I do argue in the book that they need to start enforcing this price cap more rigorously in order to drive Putin's oil revenues down. And they should be blacklisting more of these shadow fleet tankers, because not only are they helping Putin finance the war, but they are an environmental risk. They're old tankers, 25 years old, many of them. They should have been retired years ago, and they are an accident waiting to happen. So there should be more of an effort to get them out of action.
Stephanie, there's another parallel between economic war and real war, and that is, it requires constant focus and constant effort and adapting to what the other person is doing. And I'm wondering, in your more current reporting, do you see the West, the US and the EU, tiring a bit on the sanctions front, or, is the focus still there?
I think it waxes and wanes based on the political situation in each country. I mean, the UK has remained very strong in its support of Ukraine and has not wavered at all. It's very united across political parties. I think in the U.S., obviously, it's been subjected to the U.S. election, and I think the U.S. is very sensitive, in particular, to gasoline prices, and that has held them back from more aggressive enforcement because they're worried that gas prices could go up again, and that's a politically salient issue. Yeah. You do see more recently that oil prices globally are coming down. Russian oil prices have come down, a combination of reasons of that their oil overall revenue take has come down because of production cuts to stay consistent with OPEC plus, as well as declining demand, particularly a softening economy in China. So that is beginning to hurt the revenues. But I do think with oil prices coming down a bit, that may give both the US, Europe, and the UK more room to go after some of these tankers, more comfort that it's not going to cause pain at home in the form of higher energy prices.
So, Stephanie, we are where we are, right? Where do we go from here, do you think? And I guess, there's probably kind of three outcomes out there in the actual war, right? One is this continued stalemate, right, over, a much longer period of time, years, right? Another is a kind of a frozen conflict like we have in Georgia with the Russians. If the fighting stops, but the armies are still, looking at each other every day. And then the third is some kind of negotiated settlement. So how does the economic war, do you think, affect that, and how does it adapt going forward, do you think?
Right. Well, sanctions are going to be part of any of those scenarios, right? Whether it's stepped up sanctions or it's possibly, and I would be against this, but possibly some form of sanctions relief as part of a negotiated settlement. The Ukrainians, of course, are pushing back on this. They want not only a strengthened sanctions regime, more sanctions, tougher enforcement, along with more military supplies to push Russia back, to put them in a better position to negotiate. I am concerned that there may be some kind of deal, whether it's a ceasefire if Trump gets elected, given what he has said, right? He said he wants to end the war. He said he just said today at a rally in Pennsylvania that talking negatively about Zelensky, and every time he comes to the U.S., he walks away with $60 billion. So it does not sound like he's willing to continue supporting Ukraine financially. So the worry is that there could be some kind of negotiated settlement, ceasefire, ceding of territory, and possibly as part of that, some kind of limited sanctions relief for Russia. I think Russia would want and demand that as the price. But I don't think Putin has changed his overall goals of taking all of Ukraine. So I think the concern is he would use that time. And and possibly sanctions relief to regroup and rearm.
Yeah, yeah. What about this question of, and the situation would have to change significantly from where we are, I think, but this question of Ukraine getting some of that frozen central bank money to rebuild their country?
Right. So I go into the backstory on this in depth in the final chapter of the book. Ukraine's needs for rebuilding are enormous. I mean, the latest World Bank estimate is $486 billion, and that was in February. So we've had 6 months more of missile strikes and attacks that have wrought further damage on Ukraine. The U.S. finally came out and supported the full seizure of Russia's $300 billion of central bank reserves. But the problem is there was only about $5 billion in the U.S. Europe remains divided. The Baltic states and Poland want to go ahead. Hungary remains opposed. The U.S. came in March of this year and proposed a fix that they would use the interest on these reserves, which is considerable, it's $300 billion, to back up a loan for Ukraine of roughly $50 billion. But even that has come into troubled waters because the U.S. wanted assurances that the assets would remain frozen long term. And Hungary's Viktor Orban had opposed that. So they the EU at least came up with a fix that they would provide a 35 billion euro loan to Ukraine. I think ultimately this has got to happen because Western taxpayers should not be footing the bill for rebuilding Ukraine when there's Russian money on the table. And I think there's concern in Europe that this would undermine people's confidence in the euro. That's one factor. But I think the pressures to do this, everyone agrees, legal scholars agree that Russia is legally obliged to pay war reparations. So that money is never going back to Russia unless Russia agrees to pay war reparations. So in some ways, it's an accounting matter. There are concerns amongst legal scholars that this would violate the concept of sovereign immunity, which I do go into in the book. There are other legal scholars who say, no, this is perfectly legal under a concept called countermeasures that is viable under international law.
Yeah. Obviously, it also depends on who wins, right? The person that wins gets to call the shots. Unfortunately,
the person that wins the war, you mean?
Yeah.
I don't know what winning in this current war means because it doesn't seem like either side has the resources to win decisively.
Yeah, in terms of their maximalist goals, right? But winning could come out of a negotiated settlement, right?
Well, look, if Putin gets the territories that he's occupying now, that is a win, and he could dress it up as a win to the Russian population.
And if he's able to impose on Ukraine limits on their decision-making on where they want to, build their future, right, and what kind of decisions they can make on their own security, right? If he's able to impose conditions on that, he also wins.
Exactly.
And as you said, importantly, the economic war, right, can also be part of the negotiated settlement, and that could be in Russia's favor. So, maybe the last question, Stephanie, is no matter win or lose here for Putin, he has done enormous damage to his economy that will last for an extraordinary period of time. Is that the way you think about it?
Absolutely. And I don't think people are accounting for that. He has put Russia back so far. He has isolated Russia from Western technology, which is going to hobble it for decades to come. Russia suffered 700,000 to 1 million, depending on which estimate you believe, of people leaving the country. So a massive brain drain.
These are the young, educated people. Yeah.
Combined with the huge loss of life in the battleground in Ukraine, the UK Defense Ministry estimates that more than 600,000 Russian Russian soldiers have been killed or wounded, lost, and that's huge. It's a
Those
huge
are World
cost.
War I numbers. Yeah.
Yeah, and now he's reoriented to the economy to the defense industry and crowded out a lot of other sectors. So the whole issue of Russian productivity and capital allocation is all completely skewed, and that will have a huge impact for years to come as well. In some ways, Putin needs to keep this war going, because if he stops, then the economy is going to collapse.
Yeah, or fight wars elsewhere, which is the big fear, right?
Yeah.
That all of us in the kind of national security world have, of what happens if he feels he's won.
Yeah, or what happens if China looks at this and thinks, okay, well, Russia won in Ukraine. I think it could impact their decision making on Taiwan. But that's the $1 million question.
Yeah. So Putin, wants to go down in history as this great Russian leader, right? Who, reestablished the empire to some extent, and you can't have that without a strong economy, which, his own actions have destroyed.
Exactly, and that's been part of the Putin pact with the population writ large ever since he came into power. I will give you economic stability in exchange for maybe a little bit less freedom.
Yeah.
And that is quickly eroding.
Yeah.
And I think in 2025, Russia is going to face some difficult headwinds. Bloomberg's economics forecast that the Russian economy will slow to about 1% in 2025. And it'll be recovering from this very high inflation and what looks like, at least for the time being, a strengthened sanction regime. Of course, that depends on the outcome of the U.S. election.
Yeah. The book is Punishing Putin, and the author is Stephanie Baker. Stephanie, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. This is great.
That was Stephanie Baker. I'm Micah Morell. Please join us next week for another episode of Intelligence Matters.
Intelligence Matters is produced by Steve Dorsey with assistance from Ashley Berry. Intelligence Matters is a production of Beacon Global Strategies.